Good afternoon and welcome to CIPR TV on Thursday the 6th of October with me, Russell Goldsmith, and our guest presenter, David Prescott from Commucan. Now tonight we have a specially extended show, and so coming up we have a panel of political experts here to discuss the party conference season, which came to a close yesterday with the Prime Minister's speech. In around 20 minutes' time, we will then show an interview that Philip Sheldrake recorded earlier this week exclusively for CIPR TV with Carla Buzaschi, Editor-in-Chief of Huffington Post. And then following that, we will be discussing the impact of social media on lobbying skills with experts Mark Pack and Stuart Bruce.
So in our first part of the show, we're discussing the three main party conferences. Our panel consists of Iain Anderson of Cicero Consulting, John Lehal, Affairs, and Simon Goldie of LexisNexis. They know what it's like to endure the canapés, Chardonnay and other conference cliches, and they're here with us today to discuss the communications and politics that go on in public and behind the scenes.
Now, if you've got a question you'd like to put to any of our guests today or any comments on the discussion, you can send them to us in the usual way by either using the submission box on the page or tweet using the hashtag #CIPRtv, and we'll do our best to include it in the show.
Now, gentlemen, there's been a lot of talk online today or so about the fact that party conferences seem to have developed into corporate conferences. I think basically Fraser Nelson has been quite vindictive about this in some of the papers today. And the FT revealed that a remarkable statistic: out of the 30,000 people who actually went to party conferences, only a quarter were actually card-carrying members. So I ask you, Iain, has it become too corporate?
Well, they've become trade fairs, particularly at this point in the electoral cycle. I mean, trying to find a real party member is quite difficult to do. Going into the conference hall to listen to a speech become a bit pointless. They look a bit like chat shows. So a lot of the real politics, the raw decision making that used to take place and set the tone has gone out of party conferences.
Because you could argue so they're more coming like conventions now, so, and very much following what the US model probably is.
Yeah, it's just we still have to do it every year. So there's quite an interesting debate going on right now in the blogs, and Tim Montgomery's kind of been talking about this too on Conservative Home, and you mentioned Fraser Nelson, about actually whether or not there still is the need for this annual event, whether or not actually it might be better to focus on policy, to focus on manifestos, and that these events take place once every 4 or 5 years before a general election.
And the other thing, Simon, is that basically the reason why they still continue is they make money for their parties. I think they were saying that the Tory Party conference, they've raised about £2 million of that. It is important for money, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the party treasurers will be delighted. So, you know, while the members might not be too happy, but yes, it does make money, and they'll factor that in. In one way, you could say, well, this is a sign of the success of the parties, that all these people want to go along and meet the politicians and engage. But of course, it is very frustrating for ordinary party members who want to perhaps engage with the politicians and maybe get a chance to make policy. One thing we should remember is that for Labour and the Conservatives, they're not really policy-making events anymore. They used to be, but they're not now. The Lib Dems, they are to some extent, but that's getting less, I think. So when it gets to the point where they're not really making any policy at all, one may think perhaps it is better, as Iain says, to switch to a every 4 years, every 5 years event.
John, you went to 2 of the 3?
I was at Labour conference and Conservative conference, and my advice to clients is usually that you turn up to listen to the macro policy debate, so nothing better than hearing from a minister or a shadow minister what the direction of travel is for policy. Hijack other people's events by all means, but don't invest a great deal of money in terms of doing policy discussions, because people really aren't there now in an open frame of mind listening to policy debates while they're away from their civil servants who are busy in Whitehall. So to that extent, I think we're kind of losing some of the appeal that used to be associated with going to conference as a lobbyist. And certainly I think from my point of view, sit down with a group of MPs, ministers over dinner and spend time with them there, but the running around after them trying to chase them down for a meeting that you could just as well wait a week and see them in Westminster, that's kind of where you need to invest your effort.
Well, we've had a lot of questions coming through. Just picking up on something in that you mentioned right at the start about sort of becoming chat show.
Yeah.
One of the first questions: how important are the party conferences for the party leadership, and what do they want to get out of these events? Has it become a I mean, we saw various different views on all the party leaders, the way they've projected themselves in their speeches.
Well, they're still vital for the parties themselves. A lot of thought, a lot of focus group thinking goes into the messaging strategy for these events. And let's face it, it's virtually a week of guaranteed front page and top of the news headlines. That's still happening. Although and I think we're pointing to it in this conversation.
That's unless the broadcast doesn't cut while they're making this.
Well, indeed, and of course that happened to Ed Miliband.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
Disastrously, even his jokes didn't get across at that point. But I think the broadcasters are going to start to push back on this too, because they have to reflect the public consciousness that it just turning into a bit of an advert. There's no policy going on, and actually, if you can't even say a party leader and the Prime Minister can fill the convention hall, again, what's the point?
Yeah, well, it was interesting because the other day Amanda Knox taking the headline over Cameron's big speeches as well. So I mean,
But what's more important?
Yeah. Well, you can't, even the Prime Minister can't control the news agenda.
Yeah.
So you never know what's going to happen, and that's life. But I think, again, it does reflect the sense of importance of what's going on and what's being said. And our news agenda has changed, our news cycle has changed. And, you know, the communicators who are revising Cameron and Clegg and Miliband have to factor that in and think about that when they do these things.
Okay. Question here, David. I don't know if you want to take this one, and we'll go to you, John, for this.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously on the eve of each conference, you usually have a high-profile attempt to rock the boat, and this year it was Andrew Tyrie for the Conservatives, who certainly was then tracked down by for a friendly conversation by Steve Hilton, and the communications advisor as well. There's sometimes that when they try to control the message, how easy is it for a party to lose control of that message over the course of the week?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess kind of this is really brought to home by the fact that Tyrie, the chair of the Treasury Select Committee, Andrew Tyrie, was able to really dictate the news agenda on the Sunday and the Monday of conference, and major irritation for the party leadership. You know, let's remember that everything is about controlling that message, and that's why I think we're seeing a lot of the fun taken out of party conferences.
Yeah.
Certainly they're not seen as a sovereign policy-making opportunity anymore. Because the party doesn't want to be embarrassed by delegates or trade unionists, in the case of the Labour Party, turning up and maybe being too vocal or critical of the party leadership. And so therefore, you know, when you see an example like that, you recognise that the media is just desperate to hunt down some stories, some dissent, some division, and that's what they go after, because on the platform you get none of that, you get no stories.
But it can also go wrong even when you're planning it. So basically preliminating and previewing the Prime Minister's speech with obviously about pay off your credit cards.
Well, but this is it, and of course, I mean, you know, what's getting exposed here is, you know, we think that spin takes place. We know spin takes place, but actually, you know, party conferences where sort of super spin takes place, and you know, again, that got exposed through this party conference season too. So actually, I mean, this conversation that's only just starting in the last few days about what's the point in all this, I think is going to run and run.
And you think it will change next year?
Well, I don't know if I'll go as far as that, because exactly as Simon says, I mean, you know, the political parties are not publicly funded still, and they need this cash injection that takes place every year. It's almost guaranteed now at the party conference time. But I think the pressure to adapt the party conference format is not going to go away.
I think this is where we might see a shorter party conference, maybe starting on a Saturday morning, going on till a Monday lunchtime, Tuesday, because then that way you've got a greater chance of attracting the rank and file party members and delegates. I think the other thing is that at this time of the electoral cycle, it's very difficult to motivate some of those people. It is a very expensive investment in terms of hotels, travel, and time off work. So I'm not surprised by the fact that they struggle to fill the halls with delegates. But certainly, I think moving forward, they need to think about how they use the party conference window to get.
I think we may see a return to the seaside. I think already we're hearing that they are going back, and because seaside is a bit cheaper and it's actually a bit nicer as well. It's a bit of sun if you're lucky. So we, you know, it's important for members if they want to sort of take some time off work, or if they're going to go for a weekend. So we may see that, and the other thing we might see, which would be quite interesting, is maybe an attempt to engage the members a bit more, do something that would really kind of get feedback from them, get them to have a bit of a say, and then they'll come along. Because if you have an event without any members or virtually no members, really what is the point?
Well, there's a debate running this morning about whether or not actually the Tories are thinking, the grassroots Tories are thinking about having an alternative party conference where they really debate policy. And again, I think that debate's going to
And there
continue.
was a vibrancy on the fringe there. That's what Fraser Nelson was saying in his article. So the big debates, the big discussions were actually happening on the fringe in what they call the political zone. And then when they went into the conference centre, it was the convention zone.
Well, I think there's a challenge here for our industry too. That, I mean, there is, as John says, there's absolutely no point rocking up to party conference to have the same old fringe meeting that you've been having for the past 5 or 6 years. I mean, you know, it's certainly not been kind of our approach to advise people to turn up and kind of do that. And I think that's starting to break down too. Equally, the conference stands. You know, the Tory conference, you could do a bit of shopping more than you could actually see some of the corporates. It was quite incredible.
Simon, I'd like to come to you on this one because you were at the Lib Dems conference. So this question says, who should public affairs professionals focus on in the Lib Dems at the moment? So
Well, clearly, Clegg and people who are in the cabinet and the ministers and the people who are advising those cabinet members and people, researchers who are advising ministers. So that's a given. The next level are the rising stars, as they're called. What's interesting is you get some people sort of earmarked as a rising star, and then they don't quite rise sometimes. So what you also have to do is try and work out, well, who's a bit of a hidden gem. And you also have to say, well, who's doing some work around the issue that you're interested in? I think one of the challenges for public affairs professionals is that if you're in, say, the construction industry, and you've spotted a rising star, but they're doing nothing at all to do with your sector, what do you do? How do you engage with them? Because at some point they might be very important within the party. There, you need to be a little bit creative. So perhaps if you've got, you're doing a bit of work in their constituency, you then sort of engage with them on that. So we'll come down, have a look at what we're doing, meet the people we're employing. So basically, just to recap, it's the people in power, the people who might be in power, and the people who are making waves.
And how do you think Clegg fared? Because Miliband and Cameron got mixed reviews.
Yeah, well, I think Clegg did okay. I mean, I suppose the disaster headline for Clegg would have been, the party's imploding, and that didn't happen. His big narrative, I think, was all about social mobility, or the narrative he wanted. He had to spend a little bit more time in his speech talking about why the party would never go into coalition with Ed Miliband, and why it's absolutely sticking with the Conservatives. And I think that was because Tim Farron, Chris Huhne and Vince Cable made it very clear they don't really like the Conservatives. And if he hadn't shut that down, there could be questions for weeks saying, well, when are you going to leave this coalition? You don't really like it. So I think he did a good job in dealing with that, but it probably took him slightly off track from where he wanted to be.
John, if I can ask you about the Labour Party conference as well. The first conference where there wasn't really a mention of Tony and Gordon, until they'd actually mentioned it and said, I'm not Tony, left the pause, and I'm not Gordon as well. How do you think the narrative actually worked that conference?
Well, I mean, again, I think, let's remember this is Ed Miliband's first conference. He went into that with some questions being asked about his leadership. Have we picked the right leader here? Have we got the right Miliband? And I think, I think it was obviously clearly in his speech, which he personally took responsibility for rather than outsourcing it to one of his team. It got distracted with this whole good business, bad business. People kind of left asking questions around that. His attack on kind of welfare reform. I feel that it didn't quite hang together as a speech as you'd quite want. And I think, regardless of the interruption to the television proceedings, I just don't feel that he was able to get that across. And particularly because it instantly became a discussion about, well, who's he attacking here? And then, the business groups and others start jumping on that bandwagon. So my assessment, he's probably done enough. He's obviously got a shadow cabinet reshuffle coming up, but I don't think it was probably quite the convincing coverage that he would want, but still playing along with that, accepting responsibility for some of the mistakes of the last government. A real shame that the reaction to Blair that came through on the conference.
Obviously they're going through a big policy review at the moment. It's obviously very difficult to actually lobby a party or so that's obviously was in government for many years and now is in opposition. So how does the dynamic change between lobbyists and politicians who find themselves out of government?
Yeah, I mean, I think to Simon's point, there are some rising stars who it's worth investing some time in as an organisation. Clearly, you've got to do that and find the best route to those. But for me, it's about where can you secure some concessions to government policy by working with opposition. And so if you look at legislation that's going through in terms of welfare reform, in terms of the health and social care bill, it's engaging with the opposition on particular areas of policy that you think that they may be able to then apply pressure on the government as it's going through its passage in Parliament.
And who do you think the rising stars are at the moment?
Well, across all parties, I guess, if you take an indication, we're talking about party conferences, certainly on the fringe, saw a lot of Rachel Reeves. Labour. Conservatives saw a lot of the likes of Nick Bowles and Matt Hancock. Elizabeth Truss was another one talking about policy in terms of the party. And I think the darling of the Lib Dem fringe out of the new intake was someone like Julian Huppert, I'd say, who was certainly very active across a whole host of issues.
Okay, carrying on with this theme, because this is a question that's come in. So, one of the questions here: who should public affairs professionals focus on at the Tory party, so the Conservatives?
Well, clearly you've got the Prime Minister and the Chancellor there. I don't think much has changed actually from one government to another in terms of the need to focus at cabinet level, and just there are more of them at the Tory conference than there are at the Lib Dems. So you're clearly talking there, and you're also of course talking more at special advisor level as well, because if you can unlock a theme and an idea there, then it's going to get a lot more traction. Can I pick up on the point about the sort of leaders' speeches as well, if that's all right? From a Conservative perspective, clearly what Cameron was trying to do is demonstrate more effective leadership than Miliband, and he was trying to take the fairness theme away from Labour, and I think also one to watch out for in coming weeks. A lot of right of centre commentators were very attracted to that good versus bad business theme. So I think one of the things that the public affairs sector is going to have to think about in months and weeks to come is the big challenge that's coming from the Tories and from the Tory backbenches in terms of corporatism. Big business versus small business. And I think actually Cameron's going to take that theme on much more and probably more effectively than Ed Miliband can.
And Peter Bingle actually blogged this week about his golden rule for lobbyists. I'm sure it's quite a few golden rules actually. But at conferences, never to do something that you can't be done better in London. Do you agree?
I'm always very wary of agreeing with Peter Bingle, but actually on this occasion, given what we were saying about party conferences, he might have it maybe just grudgingly. I might have been slightly right. Certainly, given what we were saying a little bit earlier, if you can have a conversation without having to spend an absolute fortune running around the country going to party conferences, it's better for you, it's better for the interests you represent, and actually at the end of the day it's probably better for the taxpayer too.
I don't think there's a particular breakthrough moment. I think people like ourselves have been increasingly advising our clients to scale back their level of investment at conference anyway, so no surprises there.
I think the point John was making earlier is actually don't go there to lobby. You'll not, if you do that, you'll be very, very disappointed. But if you go there to say hello to people and to talk, and actually to talk perhaps to people in your sector or your client sector and build relationships, then you're probably going to get more out of it. And send signals, send signals to secretaries of state that you are there and important and playing a part in a dialogue and conversation about an issue. Then that's probably about the best you can hope for.
Okay. I'm very conscious of time because we've got quite a lot to get through, but there's one of the key things that's come through and we had a lot of questions on is who do you think had the most successful conference? And what I'm keen to address is from a kind of communications point of view. Who would you say start with, John?
Well, I think it was Nick Clegg. I think he went into that potentially could have received a lot of criticism for the actions of the last year, not least Lib Dems, who for many years wanted this fair voting system. That got resoundingly defeated at the polls, and so strategically, was that a big mistake for Clegg? But he came out of that pretty well, and increasing the message was about, look, bear with me, it is going to be tough, but it's going to be worth it, and I think he got that message across.
And the more you can actually have that point of differentiation and being seen as a break on the excesses of a Tory government, so the more you would like to feel as though that it would actually change. This is probably the first conference we've seen where really there's been no conference bounce for him. They pretty much are staying the same, aren't they?
No, but that's very difficult to engineer in any case. I've always been a believer that, as they used to say, politics is a knife and fork question. If people don't feel that they've got enough in their pocket, frankly, any old kind of talk or narrative at the party conferences doesn't make a blind bit of difference. I tend to agree with John, actually. It probably was Clegg that and Lib Dems that had the best conference. Labour got massively derailed in terms of focusing on Miliband's speech rather than the wider package, and we had Andrew Tyree in Catgate at the Conservative conference. So people probably, the headlines are more about that
Does that
than they
almost
were
put
about the
them
wider
back another
messages.
step, and it's like more work now to sort of reclaim some of the issues?
Yeah, but of course, if you're in government, you've got the levers of power and you've got the communications machine as well.
Yeah.
So you have a huge opportunity to get back on message and quickly. The party conferences are actually better broadly for getting a message out if you're in opposition.
Okay.
I think
Simon,
Cameron might have done okay if it hadn't been for the credit card slip up.
Right.
I think his speech was, it wasn't amazing and it wasn't probably one of his best, but it was alright, and it had certain messages that he felt he needed to get across. But because everybody was just waiting for that line about the credit card, and it was in the headlines before the speech and then afterwards, it really kind of was a bit of a
Is that
snookered
half the problem,
moment.
that everyone knows pretty much what's coming, so there's no surprise?
Why can you get excited about it?
Yeah.
Why go into the hole?
And
Yeah.
the thing is, the reassessment of growth is going from 0.2 down to 0.1, and obviously the IMF saying think about cutting, and the scale of the cutting and the time scale, and obviously, as we've seen today, quantitative easing.
But that's why the Cameron speech was so deliberately unspectacular. I mean, last year the Tory conference was all about let's not be triumphalist. This year it was, I kind of understand what you're all going through. Not designed to be tub thumping, not designed to be over the top. And Cameron was trying to contrast. I mean, this was a big comment that the business community did make to the Liberal Democrats after their conference when we heard Vince Cable. I mean, Vince Cable, you wanted, after you'd heard that speech, you wanted to go and slash your wrists. I mean, it was so gloom and doom laden. And Cameron was trying to address some of that in his remarks.
Okay. Well, it's been fascinating with you. We have already been going about 25 minutes, I've been told. So we're going to have to, unfortunately, cut this part of the show short. But thank you, all of you, for joining us. We've also got coming up in 10 minutes, both myself and David will still be here, and we're going to be joined by Mark Pack and Stuart Bruce to discuss the impact that social media is having on public affairs. But before that, earlier this week, Philip Sheldrake caught up with Carla Buzzacchi, the editor-in-chief of the Huffington Post UK, for an exclusive interview for CIPR TV. And here is that interview.
Hi, this is CIPR TV and I'm Philip Sheldrake. I'm speaking today with Carla Buzzacchi, Editor-in-Chief of the Huffington Post UK. And Carla's also going to be joining the CIPR at the Social Media Conference on the 14th of November 2011. Hi Carla.
Hello.
For joining us.
My pleasure.
So, describe the role. What's your responsibility as Editor-in-Chief in the UK?
So I'm overseeing all my editors. I've got 16 editors in the team now, with the 17th arriving in December. So overseeing what they're doing, but also acting as the face. Obviously, Ariana Huffington is the face of this brand globally. She can't be in the UK very often. So I'm out there trying to drum up new viewers for the site, new fans for Huffington Post, and making sure everyone knows what we're all about.
So Huffington Post started in the US in 2005.
2005,
and the
yes.
UK launched this year.
Yes.
So what's the genesis for that?
So it was July the 6th. It launched here, and sort of working back from there. Phenomenally successful site in the US. It's the most linked to blog on the internet. I think it's probably the most read news site in the US now. AOL bought the Huffington Post at the beginning of this year and decided to launch it in a number of other countries. Canada came first, and then UK followed a few months after that.
So you still refer to it as a blog?
Well, the blog is a very important part of it, and in 2005 that was the vision for it. It was a group blog. Now it's a news site, or the internet newspaper as we like to see ourselves. It's a news site with blogs, a very, very important part of that.
So I tweeted last night and said, did anybody have any questions for you? And the first question I have is from an Iain Thompson.
Okay.
And he's going to level the question at you that you'll have heard since Huffington Post formed in 2005, which is quality journalism or a content farm?
Definitely.
Content farm not being a complimentary phrase.
Definitely quality journalism. I have hired some really, really good editors, even if I do say so myself. I'm going to take some of the credit for that. No, we've got a fantastic team of editors, big experience at BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, Daily Mail, great journalists, and they are charged with creating brilliant original journalism day in, day out. But we support that with opinions from 1,500 bloggers we've got in the UK now. It's about 24,000 in the US, so we've still got a little way to go. But in 3 months, we've got 1,500 people who are contributing regularly to the site, and they're saying what their opinion on the news is. And I think that balancing out, that's what makes the Huffington Post unique in comparison to all the other newspaper websites out there.
So what do you think, how would you define your reason for being? Why does the Huffington Post UK exist?
Because I think there's a place online for a different opinion. All the newspapers in this country are very politically aligned one way or another, and the people who read them have probably been reading those papers day in, day out.
And you're not liberal-leaning?
We're not liberal-leaning, we're trying to be very, very...
It says in the Wikipedia entry that you're liberal-leaning.
Oh, well, I think that in the US that's perhaps the impression that it's gone, and that's definitely how it started. But look at the US site now as well. I mean, Ariana herself has been very critical of Obama, and I think what was very important for us is that we were able to support either party, criticise either party, and support issues that we felt were important to the country. And that doesn't mean that we need to be aligned to one party or another.
So that's your differentiation. We have another tweet came in from Mary Pollard asking you, who do you see your competition as in the UK?
I think that there's different ways you can look at it. From a newspaper angle, from a news angle, we want to be seen as important as The Guardian, The Telegraph, The Independent. We want people to believe that we are a place to come for quality journalism. From a blog site, I mean, you know, the UK's got thousands, millions of different blogs popping up, especially at the moment, and certainly in the political sphere, they're becoming much better. There are more of them and they're getting more and more users. But I think what makes us unique is that we're the only place where you get both of that. So yes, you've got Commenters Free on The Guardian, which is a fantastic blogging site, but it's very specific to people who support The Guardian, and it's mainly journalists who are blogging. Whereas on the Huffington Post, you've got normal people. You can blog, I can blog, my mum blogs, my sister blogs, but David Cameron blogs as well. And it's that mix of famous names, celebrities, MPs, and normal people on the street who want to give their opinion on the big news articles of the day.
And so what does your mum blog about?
She's a teacher. So she blogs about education, anonymously, I would say. She look for a photograph of a teacher with a hat and sunglasses on, that's my mum.
We had a tweet in last night from Stuart Bruce, who asks about the viability of recycled content, given the more heterogeneous media environment in the UK. Because in the US we know that the dailies are just collapsing in on themselves. There are many cities now with not even one daily newspaper that's viable. In the UK, journalism still just about pays, and we've got lots of good quality broadsheets out there. How are you going to compete?
I think we've got a fantastic sales team. We've got AOL's sales force behind us, and that's really important. We've got people who understand the digital sphere. I can go into the I can give you the sales pitch if you want, but I will keep it very, very short. We have something called Devil, which is a unique ad format, which gives 100% share of voice on the page. Very interactive ad format that AOL launched last year. That's available on Huffington Post internationally and has been really, really successful. And that's certainly our launch advertising partners love that. But also we do things like sponsored blogs, sponsored comments. So we're allowing companies to come and have their CEOs to have a say on our site. It's very clearly labelled that this is coming from someone who's paying, but they get to be on our site and get their opinion across, straight from the horse's mouth, as it were. And that's something that advertisers in this country are very excited about.
So I was part of a contingent in 2001 that hosted a group from MIT coming over to London to talk about this new thing called blogging.
Yes.
And we had blogging, and it was from people who wanted a voice that social media lends them.
Yes.
And then you had quality journalism. And are you saying that you found the best of both worlds in Huffington Post?
That's exactly what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying. We're bringing the two together. So our blogs sit in the left-hand side of our site, so you know where it's coming from, very clearly labelled that these are individuals blogging, where they're from, who they are. And then middle of the site, right-hand rail of the site, that's where you get the journalism. We do some aggregation as well, so we are very open about this. If someone's got a fantastic story that we think our users would be interested in, we link straight out to it. When the hacking scandal broke, this was the Guardian story, so we linked out to the Guardian left, right and centre for readers to get their take on it. And then we had a live blog running on our site as news came in, and we were compiling all the tweets that people were talking about, and we were then going and interviewing other people about what their opinion was it. But this was the Guardian story, and therefore we should be sending our readers to read their take on it.
So how do the contributors feel when the founders walk off with a cheque for 300 million? How does that change the ethos and philosophy for their eagerness to participate going forward?
Well, as I said, 1,500 bloggers in less than 3 months. So we don't seem to have a problem with people blogging on the site. I think there's been some confusion about it. This is a platform for people to have opinion. This is just the same as Twitter. This is just the same as Facebook. But you're doing it in an area where you know people are coming to read something rather than just very, very short tweets. So we don't pay people to blog, but we don't commission them to blog either. You blog as frequently or as infrequently as you want to. And I think what certainly the MPs like is they're getting a chance to get their full opinion across rather than in an interview situation. And what you then find is one will blog, but then one perhaps from another party will come back and do a counter blog to get their argument across. They're not asking for money because this is just a great place for them to speak to millions of people about what's important to them.
Well, congratulations on getting the editor-in-chief position.
Thank you.
Where do you see Huffington Post in 3 years from now?
I want
Huffington Post UK.
Huffington Post UK. Well, I'm quite happy if Huffington Post globally is the first destination people go for news. I want this to be part of people's daily routine. You get to the office, you turn on your computer, and Huffington Post is the first place you go to get the news of the day. In fact, scrap that. I don't want them to do it when they get to the office. I want them to do it on the train into the office. I want them to be on their iPad or on their BlackBerry, on their smartphone, and coming to us for news. And everyone blogging as well. That would be good too.
Carla, thanks very much for joining us today. Much appreciated.
My pleasure.
Welcome back to CIPR TV. We're broadcasting live from Marketeers 40C Studios, and a quick reminder that if you want to contribute to the show, then just send us your questions and comments using the submission box on the page or tweet using the hashtag #CIPRtv, and that's exactly what a few people have done, and I'm just going to give a couple of shout outs to Debs, Sally J, Phil M, Ed Roddis and Mike Robb, all on Twitter, who have all sent in their comments, and thank you very much. We can't get through all the comments that are going through, but we'll try and get through as many as we can in the next part of the show.
Okay. Now, social media has revolutionised communications and is challenging the relevance of traditional PR and marketing skills. One area which is seeing a profound change is public affairs. Political parties, governments, and perhaps most importantly, voters are enthusiastically embracing social media. And policies can be crowdsourced, ministers can seek out information from special interest groups through networking platforms, and search is becoming a vital tool of getting information in front of the right people. But how do public affairs professionals stay on top?
Now, for the final part of today's show, we are joined by Mark Pack, Lib Dem blogger and head of digital at MHP Communications, and Stuart Bruce, a communications consultant and author of the forthcoming CIPR Skills Guide on social media and public affairs.
Mark, if I can ask you, what are the opportunities in social media that public affairs professionals should be aware of?
They're immense, really, and I think they fall into two categories. One is the way you can use social media to help mobilise public opinion, and the other is the way that you can use social media personally to go about doing your job, because social media is a fantastic way to find out more about topics, find out more about people you might be wanting to target or communicate with, and indeed deepen relations with them. So what you see some people in public affairs doing, for example, is using Twitter very effectively to build up personal relationships with key political journalists, which then means when you've got the more formal approach or the press release or the press stunt or perhaps even a fringe meeting at party conference, you've got a bit of a personal relationship there. And in a way, I think the way to think about it is social media is a bit like the telephone now. You can work in public affairs and refuse to use a telephone, but it's a bit odd and you're not really as good at your job as someone who is willing to use the telephone.
And journalists and politicians are quite similar because they took a bit of time to actually acknowledge things like Twitter.
Yeah.
And now they realise that Twitter is like the Press Association. It's a massive news feed of people and opinions. And I know from experience that people can tweet things out and within about 5 minutes or so it can be breaking news on Sky News as well. So it's interesting to see how do politicians deal with that now?
Well, I heard an event about a year ago, Laura Kusenberg talking about Twitter, and I think she put it very well, where she said that it's become the political newswire of choice for political journalists in Westminster. And therefore what that means is if you're not paying attention to it, and indeed if you're not participating in it, you're isolating yourself from the very community that you should be part of and you should be listening to and you should be influencing. But I think it's also a relatively open community, and it's much easier to break into that community on Twitter than, for example, it would have been 20 years ago to break into the community of people who all went to the same university and eat at the same restaurant and a member of the same private members club. So although there is a certain cliquiness about it, it's a much more open clique. And I think that's a real advantage for people who are wanting to make their way in a profession.
Stuart, I'd like to bring you into the show here. We've got a question here that says, good lobbyists have always understood the importance of transparency in influencing public policy, but is social media changing public affairs and making it more transparent? Is that a good thing, or is it a challenge for the public affairs professionals?
I think I would say it's both. That yes, it is making it more transparent and more open. And I think it's kind of exposing kind of the tradition, the idea that lobbying is about having a drink in a bar just isn't true anymore, and hasn't been true for a long, long time. And I think what we're seeing is that those types of relationships are now moving into the open. And it's also about looking at the different levers that you use in public affairs, because the kind of public perception is, oh, it's all about lobbying MPs and ministers. Well, actually, there's different levers you can use. So looking at what other opinion formers are saying, what the media is saying, are all just as important. And that's one of the ways where you can actually leverage social media. So I think it is having a kind of profound difference. And I think the other aspect to it is the kind of the water cooler thing of you don't actually have to be actively participating in terms of saying lots and lots, but you can still use it as an intelligence source and to find things out.
Do you have any tips to help public affairs professionals sort of building up their Twitter following? Is it a case of constantly blogging?
I think my number one tip would probably be yourself, because you can't fake it. If you've got kind of millions of, if you've got kind of lots and lots of people looking at what you're doing, if you're trying to fake it, it won't work. So be yourself, which means don't feel pressured to be that active Twitterer if you don't want to. You can just use it to listen. But once you've been listening, you probably do want to participate. So it's kind of, my advice would be take baby steps. Don't think you've got to
social media is more just about Twitter, because obviously there's other tools that you should be using.
But when you look at someone like Craig Oliver at number 10, he's now actually has, I think it was revealed this week, DirCom10.
Yes.
At DirCom10. And he's basically used that as a listening device. He used to tweet before when he was at the BBC, but obviously it's almost like an early warning system now. To see if there's any mass that's building and rising, and to be fair, it's like a focus group anyway, isn't it, really? An early warning device. Do you think
and you see it a lot, particularly with BBC journalists, that they will tweet about a story and maybe a brief comment or, ooh, this is the interesting part of the speech, and that tweet will appear several hours before the story, the fuller version of the story appears on the BBC website or in the BBC Evening News. So if that's an issue that you're interested in and you're listening, that immediately gives you a few hours opportunity to get your story over, to get your fact over, to get your spokesperson quoted, and that's often really advantageous, but you can only make use of those opportunities if you're listening, and if, as Stuart was saying, if you're sort of engaging with a friendly human tone of voice, because otherwise people won't want to listen to you.
But you do have to be careful though, don't you? Because sometimes something could be on Twitter and you think you'd take that as established fact, but actually, as we saw this week with this whole thing with Primal Scream, was rocks used before just after Theresa May came off? It was actually the Dandy Warhol's Bohemian Like You, but there's a statement that was then put up by Primal Scream which basically said they were completely against the idea of the track being used, and then it turned out so it wasn't that at all. And there was a big Twitter thing, and we saw, I think, hashtag Tory Tunes then sort of like took off through from there, all based on the fact actually it was a false story. So you've got to be careful, really, certainly on Twitter, about accepting something as fact, don't you?
Yeah, although it's not exactly new for journalists and others to be caught out by inaccurate information. I think the thing about Twitter is the speed of it should give you a healthy warning that, hang on a minute, this probably hasn't been fully cross-checked before the comment was made, in a way that actually I think it's more dangerous the way in which you can be misled by, say, a story that appears in a newspaper that has an apparent veneer of, yes, must have been properly checked, gone through the legal team and everything that appeared in print, but actually doesn't always have that. So with Twitter, at least it's got the inbuilt health warning, it's on Twitter, it was done quickly, therefore follow up and check before you believe
it. It's very dangerous, like the Mail putting up their story about Madeline's being guilty. But
and they used to say as well that Sky News, they just have a slogan called "Not Wrong for Long,"
as they demonstrated.
On that point, there's a question coming out. I mean, good and bad examples of governments, politicians, and maybe lobbyists, using social media to engage.
I mean, I think a good example of someone who's done it both well and not so well, almost at the same time, was Louise Mensch. So, knowing that the media were sniffing around that story about her past private life, she went online and she went sort of upfront with saying, this is what I've done in the past, it's not really a story. And in a way, she used things like Politics Home website and Twitter and so on very effectively to get her message out. But where she went wrong was she didn't then respond to people subsequently. So she was effective at saying, look, I might have done something 20 years ago, it doesn't really matter. But she then failed to respond when people were saying, yeah, but if you still think drugs should be criminalised, then you're saying if someone does this evening what you did 20 years ago, they should be jailed, so how does that square? Yeah. And when you then just don't respond to those points at all, that actually leaves, you know, a fairly poor, almost slightly shifty, evasive image, when actually had she responded at least to some of the more polite comments coming back, I think she would have come out of it even better than she did.
Okay. Question here, can you give any examples of successful campaigns where social media has been instrumental in influencing public policy? That's quite
I think one thing I would say to that is that I would rarely say that social media should be the only element of what you're doing. So that with that kind of warning, if you look at some of the things that 38 Degrees have been doing, with things like the forestry campaign to prevent the sell-off of the forests, you know, that a lot of that happened online, and it was a major driver to what was happening. But there was also other stuff happening. The fact that you know, you could actually, I think, looking at the example of kind of that's probably started with Obama in the States of trying to have online action, online activity convert into real world action. I think that's probably the most powerful thing you can do.
And interesting as well that you say that. Everyone talks about social media, but obviously one of the biggest drivers or so for activity and getting people moving is the simple email. So some people actually forget that. And actually that was more what Obama actually did. It was basically email.
Okay.
But it also made it so easy to get involved. I mean, we went on. I remember we went on holiday to the States during that period, and I deliberately didn't want to kind of get involved in campaigning through kind of formal routes of being invited, and we just literally hooked up locally while we were there to do something, and it was so easy because you could get on the list and you could get invited to things.
Can I ask you, as public affairs professionals, the technology that we have now that basically you can send, if you go to Ravaz or you go to 38 Degrees and you basically put your email details on there and that's sent directly to your local MP. Now what's happened now is they just treat it as spam now, don't they? It needs to be a personalised approach. How can you actually use social media to have that personalised approach to the MP instead of it just being a blanket letter or so which is just copied and pasted and just...
I think the two key things that often make the difference between an unsuccessful campaign that's seen as spam and a really successful one is segmenting your audience properly. So Julian Hubbard, Liberal Democrat MP for Cambridge, he recently sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek complained about the number of people who lobby him, asking him to sign an EDM, when in fact it's an EDM that he himself has tabled. And so, you know, the pressure groups in that case are just failing to say to their supporters in Cambridge, look, send a different message from elsewhere. And the second thing is getting people to use their own words. I recently took part in I thought, a very clever sort of campaign that Unlock Democracy were running to get people to take part in the public consultation on the future of the House of Lords. And there's a natural tendency simply to say, yes, I believe in elections, end of story. And they had a very sensible set of web pages that stepped you through answering all the different questions in the consultation, but then forcing you almost to put in some of your own words as well, so that what then got sent off to the consultation wasn't simply the sort of spam type pro form where everyone says the same thing, but was something that was actually from me, reflecting my own views in a different way from somebody else might have said.
And I think the other thing you can do is by actually getting people to talk about it online, you can actually, instead of having that push mechanism, you can create a pull one. You know, so the example of one of the kind of projects that I worked on was for a charity where they were releasing a report. And what we did is we got lots and lots of conversation going on a particular day, because the logic was if enough people were talking about this online and there was enough kind of buzz about it, then the politicians would actually come to them and say, oh, and what's all this about? Why don't we know about it? And it worked. We said we were going to get one of the parties to call them. By the end of the day, all three had called asking for more information because they knew it was something they couldn't ignore.
One way of getting buzz going is to use a kind of large online media property. So there's a question here. We've seen that party leaders court Mumsnet. I suppose I should say other websites are available. We've seen party leaders court Mumsnet and other online platforms to get their message across. Who do politicians listen to most online? What's the tipping point for platforms like Mumsnet, and how active and influential do they need to be heard? Either of you want to...
the big advantage that something like Mumsnet has is that it simply has a large audience. Yeah. So even if you look at it purely from a conventional media planning type perspective, large audience, therefore worth taking part in.
They use their discussion boards quite well.
Exactly, and very heavy levels of traffic and involvement. But I think often the smarter opportunities that are available are online outlets and online channels that have maybe quite a small audience, but really get read by some of the key people you want to reach. Okay. So, for example, outside of my day job, I'm the co-editor of the Liberal Democrat Voice blog, which, because it's the most highly read Liberal Democrat blog, actually has a high readership amongst Liberal Democrat SPADs in Whitehall. So if you're wanting to get your message in front of SPADs, who often are very resistant to receiving communications from what perceived as lobbyists through all sorts of other means, actually, if you know that's one of the media outlets they consume regularly, you see various organisations placing guest posts there with, I'm sure, that in mind, that they can get something read by a SPAD that way that would be much harder to get in front of them through other routes.
You said a very interesting thing at conference, at Lib Dem conference.
More than one, I think.
Oh, yeah, more than one thing. But one thing certainly got picked up there when you were talking about politicians. You said that people could learn a lot, Lib Dems could learn a lot from John Prescott, on the basis that a campaign that can be done, someone out of government but still supporting his party, but still having that ability to basically go harder and faster and more critical than the government could be. Now, you're facing the same position now that so much you are in coalition, and it's very difficult to try and get the messages out there, and that there needs to be that kind of independent voices basically channeling campaigns and running that. How easy is that going to be?
I don't think either of them will thank me for saying this, but in a way Tim Farron is the Liberal Democrats' John Prescott in that respect, that he's a member of a party that's in government, but because he's not in government himself, he has that same extra freedom that John Prescott has. Now, I think what Tim has gone for is a slightly different route from John Prescott's, that Tim is much more using traditional media rather than online, although he uses Twitter very effectively, but he's not using social media to mobilise campaigns in a way that John Prescott did. And certainly, if I was giving Tim advice, I would say, actually, I think you should go further down that route of using the online mechanisms more, because it's a great way of exerting pressure. It's also a great way of raising and keeping morale high amongst your own supporters as well.
We've mentioned, we've mentioned Twitter and blogs quite a bit. What about Facebook? Is there a role for Facebook in lobbying?
There is, but I think it's about treating people how they want to be treated in the space that they are. So I think going in too aggressively into spaces like Facebook, Facebook is, if you actually speak to people about why they use it, what they want to do on there, you've got to actually do things that they want, and they don't necessarily want to see heavy political campaigning. But if you're maybe creating interesting content that they just genuinely want to share with their friends, or you're maybe making something that's quite a dry, dull subject into something that's fun, and you're making it relevant to them, then that's when platforms like Facebook can begin to become relevant.
And that's why My David Cameron actually took off, wasn't it? Because it was all like the competition where we'll give you a template, here's the picture, have fun with it, a few people have come up with some ideas, and it's a bit like everybody always wants to come with, if it's like that interaction, everyone wants to beat each other and come up with a better idea. And from there, it really kind of like took off and basically destroyed like a £500,000 advertising campaign.
And I think what was also unintentional but made it very effective was the way the mainstream media picked up on it. So, for example, I used the My David Cameron thing to come up with, obviously pre-coalition times, to come up with a knocking anti-Tory poster, which then was one of about half a dozen that the Daily Mail picked up and republished. Now, that ability for me sat at home, one evening, to think of a half-humorous comment that then ends up a couple of days later in front of millions of people around the country is a really powerful tool. And very often what makes the use of online successful is where you have not just the online audience, but some sort of offline media coverage that comes off the back of it. And the use of net mums is a classic, because TV evening news still love talking about politician. This today went to net mums and asked what biscuit do they like and didn't answer it and all of that sort of stuff. TV news still loves reporting.
Stu, can I ask you about that? Because it is quite interesting. It was probably successful because it wasn't really party political based. It was actually just people just having some fun. So it wasn't really owned by a party. It was just basically people just saying, having a bit of fun, spelling things from there. The challenge is for political parties is to try and actually grab some of that and do that, but then it loses its authenticity, because then it's like command and control message, isn't it?
It does, and it depends how the parties do it, because I don't think any of them have really grasped it properly yet, because you have got to get rid of that centralisation model. And I think Labour is probably one of the most guilty of trying to do that kind of top-down approach. A far better one is to actually start equipping supporters with those skills, because showing them what they can do and doing that sort of training, that sort of enabling with them, and then you don't know what they're going to do with it. They're maybe not going to go off on message, but they're probably going to be doing something that's still pretty supportive.
Time's beaten us, unfortunately. One very quick tip from each of you for public affairs professionals on social media.
If you're not on Twitter, get on Twitter.
Okay. And Stuart?
You have to use social media. It's the same as using the telephone.
Fantastic. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today, so thank you again to our final guests, Mark and Stuart.
Now do look out for the CIPR Skills Guide on Public Affairs and Social Media, and Stuart is also going to be hosting a CIPR webinar on this topic. More information can be found on the CIPR website.
Now don't forget, all CIPR TV shows are available on demand via the CIPR's website, YouTube channel, and you can also download them from iTunes too. Just search CIPR TV on the iTunes store. And don't forget, just a quick plug here for the CIPR's social media conference, which is taking place on November the 14th, so get in touch via the website to register your interest and book a place. We're back next month for the CIPR presidential debate to hear what each of the candidates has to say before voting closes in the election for the next year's president-elect. Until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.